It's ominous again, as it was in 2014. At that time, Russian troops and tanks poured into eastern Ukraine, while the West watched in shock. And this year, Russia once again galvanized anti-Ukrainian propaganda, amassing an estimated 175,000 troops along Ukraine's border, along with tanks, artillery, and materiel. All this raised the alarm that Russia was preparing to launch the largest military offensive in Europe since World War II. In an effort to ease tensions, President Biden spoke with President Putin on Tuesday. Biden made progress in noting the significant cost of invading Ukraine, and made clear that the United States was prepared to impose punitive economic measures to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. However, this may not be enough to deter Putin, as Russia has raised $620 billion to counter even tougher sanctions. Putin knows that such sanctions are unlikely in the first place, because US allies in Europe would also be harmed. Providing Ukraine with larger weapons such as anti-aircraft and anti-ship missiles would be beneficial, but history suggests that the US government cannot afford to take this step. In order to change Putin's calculus, it is necessary to change the Biden administration's policy toward Ukraine both tactically and strategically to show a more active level of American interaction, but that avoids going into military adventures. There is a larger issue at stake: the vital role that a free and sovereign Ukraine plays in advancing U.S. interests against those of Russia and China. The United States should support Ukraine with more extensive military assistance, deep and sustainable diplomatic engagement, and more critical economic cooperation. So far, U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine has failed to contain the Kremlin. When it comes to Russia's neighbors, Washington's role has settled on a negative and at best volatile performance in its friendship with Ukraine. On the other hand, Russia was interested in preserving its sphere of influence and in restoring its most important imperial possessions, i.e. Ukraine and Belarus. No doubt Putin, who has been watching America's diminishing appetite for foreign entanglements over the past few years, has seized a window of opportunity to encroach on Ukrainian sovereignty, including the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass region. Even interference in Western elections is just another tactic to weaken the West and create a distinct sphere of Russian influence. The crisis on Ukraine's horizon today is simply a continuation of Putin's ambitions. And statements like Biden's on Wednesday that American interests end at the borders of NATO have encouraged Putin to disregard international norms. This American neglect must end. The United States and Ukraine share the same ideology and long-term geopolitical interests. Over the past 30 years, Ukraine has made great strides in its democratic experiment. Despite alarming cases of government-backed corruption, there is no doubt that there is still more work to be done, Ukraine has made painstaking progress on reform in the midst of war. After 6 presidents, 2 revolutions, and many violent protests, the Ukrainian people have sent a clear message that reflects the most important American values. They will fight for basic rights, and against authoritarian oppression. A prosperous Ukraine, backed by American backing, makes authoritarian Russia unviable in the long run. Ukraine's success would upend Russia's unreliable aspirations for empire and highlight the Kremlin's failures, as West Germany's past accomplishments compared to totalitarian East Germany during the Cold War. It might even convince the Russian people, who share their Ukrainian counterpart in culture, history, and religion, to eventually demand their own framework of democratization. Certainly, this does not happen overnight. Intergenerational investment is essential to achieving this vision. Yet the outlines of the stark contrast between a prosperous, democratic Ukraine and an economically repressive Russia are already evident. Which is why Putin is intent on turning Ukraine into a failed state. U.S. support for Ukraine could help drive a wedge between China and Russia. Preventing Putin from invading Ukraine reflects the strength of the West's commitment to opposing authoritarianism, and makes Russia a less powerful partner for China in its joint effort to undermine the international order built on Western foundations. To this end, the United States should consider an out-of-the-ordinary divisional military deployment in Eastern Europe to reassure allies and bolster NATO defenses. This type of deployment may indicate that Russian aggression may have security repercussions that Moscow is unwilling to confront. The United States cannot support Ukraine sufficiently without significant European participation. The Kremlin wants to make Ukraine's NATO membership a central issue in any discussions. This is an obvious distraction because ensuring that Ukraine will not be part of NATO is unlikely to prevent Russia from continuing its attempts to subjugate it. The most important issue to bear in mind is that negotiations with Russia must be addressed at the level of European security. These talks should create political outlets that allay European and Russian security concerns. For Russia, NATO encroachments, and ballistic missile defense. As for NATO, Russia suffers from excessive militarization on its western borders. The Biden-Putin call on Tuesday opened the door to this kind of discussion. The question remains, is Russia ready to walk through that door and reconsider its position on conventional arms control agreements, such as the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty? The United States should engage Ukraine in longer-term bilateral initiatives on security, reform, and economic cooperation. This year, Washington provided nearly $450 million in security assistance to Ukraine. Despite its importance, economic cooperation must go further, to include support for U.S. commercial investment through the Development Finance Corporation. Washington should also consider maintaining a more sustainable high-level relationship with